in reality, you may be more qualified with your chair to talk about it than I was. I also worked with Elon Musk. I worked with Elon. I was his VP of Communications and Marketing for a year, which makes me the longest surviving VP of Communications that he's ever had to walk out on his own steam. I mean, Elon is, I don't know if you guys know who Elon is, Tesla, the electric motor cars, and SpaceX. An amazing guy and an amazing ego. It's truly stunning. But you know, to be able to pull off what he's done, you know, it's part of the thing you need it. I don't know what you guys were expecting to hear. This is going to be kind of an anti-space talk more than a pro-space talk, because I think that if you really look honestly at the space program and America's space program to understand why where it is and why where it is, that's what it takes, and like so many people don't. I originally wanted to call this, I think, Space, Another Science Fiction, which is actually the title of a book that was written by ad executives, which was talking about how industry sold the space program to the government in the United States in the 1959, in the 1950s and 60s, promising all these amazing things that were going to happen. And they had these advertisements from the magazines back then, which were, some of them were awesome. It has actually a picture of an astronaut like riding a rocket like a cowboy with a lasso, trying to reach and grab a satellite. And ironically, if you listen to the guys in the business, they still talk about something that's not too far off from that. I am not a natural fit for space. I spent most of my life as a war correspondent, and I came to space purely by accident. The accident was Rupert Murdoch took over the newspaper where I was working at, and I had worked for him once years before, and I said I wasn't going to do it again. And there was a job open up for the Tribune Group covering space out here. And I thought, what a cool opportunity. I was not a space nerd. I didn't grow up wanting to be space. If I had a little sticker that said if I went to space, the word would be vomit, because, you know, I took skydiving lessons from the belief that it would make me not afraid of heights, and it didn't do anything of the sort. But I learned how to fall and scream in a coordinated fashion. Anyway, but I figured it would be cool. It was a national program. I had covered, you know, the federal government for a few years. I came back after 9/11 because I'm an Arabic speaker. I had lunch one time with Osama bin Laden, which was a really weird and completely different other story. And I was covering the government reforming in the aftermath of 9/11, so when I needed to leave, I figured this could be really cool. I get to live out on the coast. I'm from Florida originally, and I know that living near the coast is always better than living, you know, further inland because of the heat, the moisture, really. Anyway, and I could cover this national program, which was in transition. It would be very interesting, but I had really no idea of what to expect. And I always had the feeling that, you know, NASA had this amazing presence. You know, that meatball sort of signified, you know, technological superiority, and everybody wanted to associate with it. So it was really weird driving out there for the first kind of shuttle operations and seeing guys working with like gauges and analog meters, and the whole shuttle program, in a way, what I later learned, was like the perfection of a corkscrew. I mean, the space shuttle had a 286 processor in it, the last ones that came down. Some of them were upgraded, but not too far from that. And it was very typical. But anyway, so the first thing that I went to cover, which will get to my whole point of where we were, was the mission was called STS-120. And it was, as far as I could tell for a newbie's perspective, was they were flying the shuttle up there to stick a tin can, screw a tin can onto a bunch of other tin cans, which was forming the International Space Station. And then they were going to put on this truss and roll out these solar arrays, which was looking like, to me, a giant laundry line that they were going. So I thought it was very typically, you know, oh, this is not very exciting, really, is it? And what ended up happening was, and it was one of those rare moments inside of NASA in space. I mean, how many of you guys have seen Apollo 13? Yes? I mean, the best scene in the movie is when they're all, everything's all messed up and they empty a bag out in that MacGyver moment where they have like a toothbrush, a toothpick, a strand of hair, and they say, we got to save them with this. And in reality, that's kind of what ended up happening in this particular moment. What happened is the power system was the key to making the space station work. It had to generate power. It had to generate enough power for more shuttle missions to basically build more, and electricity became the key. And so these solar arrays, these big sheets of very thin material that collected the solar energy, was the key. And as they put this thing up and they pushed a button to kind of unfurl it, and it got caught. Part of it got caught, and it was like a tin can that wasn't ripping right. It was like the solar arrays were ripping. And they, all of a sudden there was panic because they were in big trouble right now because they just couldn't make another one and send it up. So they had to figure out what to do. And they came up with this kind of very crazy plan in which they would take everything that they had that was long, the boom on the space shuttle, and then you add that to the arm, and then you put a strap, and they basically created this kind of makeshift fishing pole that they could extend, and like a worm at the end of the fishing pole, they would put an astronaut, and they would swing him out to this area, which would be the furthest out anyone had ever gone, because the general rule was you could never go more than 30 minutes away from that airlock, because if something went wrong, by the time they brought you back, you were like in a sci-fi movie with all over the inside of your shield, right, your face mask. So this was more than 30 minutes out. And he had to basically figure out a way to beat back the solar arrays, which, by the way, you can't turn on and off. Once there's sun and these things are out there, even though some of it was bunched, some of it was exposed, so it was coursing with electricity. So there was a lot of drama. But of course, NASA being NASA didn't want to play up the drama. NASA wants to make you think that everything they do is kind of, oh, it's just what we do. I actually had a guy say, with hands crossed, saying, if America doesn't appreciate what we do, perhaps America doesn't deserve us, and then looked off into the distance. And I thought, good luck with that. Anyway, so NASA made a huge deal about trying to say, this isn't dangerous. I mean, imagine you're eating, it's about the same dangers if you fall, he literally said this, if you are eating dinner and fall backwards and your fork accidentally goes into the socket, which of course I consider a major problem at my household, and you're thinking, like, first off, the ability to imagine that metaphor, but secondly, all of a sudden you knew this smells like bullshit. So of course, the reality of the bullshit became because it was really interesting, because I'd never covered anything with space. I'd never watched it closely. So I remember I had to wake up at like 4 o'clock in the morning or 3 o'clock in the morning and turn on NASA TV. And it was a rather interesting perspective, because you've got a camera on a shoulder and one on a helmet. So you were literally seeing point of view as this astronaut's going out. And being a newsman, you rarely get to see kinds of dangerous stuff being performed with that perspective. Usually when something goes wrong, there's a police line and there's people who are telling you what's going on there, but you really don't have this eyewitness account. So you have this unique perspective, and as they're putting this human worm out to this area, and by the way, what they've devised was they took a piece of plastic and they cut it out like a hockey stick, and his job was to kind of like push the panel back, and as it would move back, he would go in and kind of stitch at like a giant shower curtain and kind of move it along, and as the live panel swung back, he would duck. And it was incredibly bizarre. But the thing is as they're lifting him out there, they're required to describe to him all the dangers he faces. And it's horrific, because if you touch it, we don't know if your head will inside the helmet. You could have a heart attack. You could be electrocuted. If your suit gets cut by the, you will lose air at a rate faster than. And it was everything that it was definitely the equivalent of falling backwards with a fork into, the socket. And so all of a sudden you're realizing not the level to which you were lied to, but really how risky what he was doing, how really risky it was. And the thing is, while he was doing it, you had the live soundtrack of all his comrades back inside the station talking to him, going, ooh, ooh, ouch, ooh, no, watch it. And you hear them breathing, and I'm like with popcorn now watching this unfold. And it was really dramatic. It was really a very rare event. And I figured to myself, God, if this is going to be like this, I did pretty well. This is going to be a really interesting ride. Of course, it wasn't like that. Now, the thing that became very, very interesting is the next day when there was a press conference after he successfully repaired it, and he pulled out the shower curtain and the power levels were where they were, and it was NASA at its best doing something unchoreographed and clever with, in that MacGyver-like moment that, people think of the space program, because the space program isn't really like that. It's incredibly rigid and choreographed. If you're an astronaut, your image is carefully tended and maintained. Thus, if you get diapers and drive across the country wanting to kill your rival in love, that's, we don't know the history of it. She was an exception. In reality, astronauts are people, but NASA does not want us to believe this, because what they do is, as you will see, this epiphany that I had was the next day at this press conference, the head of the program, and remember, this is 2007, so the Iraq War is blazing in the background. The opinion of the war is turning, bodies are starting to turn up. As a country, we're not really in a happy place. And this guy comes into this press room. His name was Wayne Hale, and he has a tremendously beautiful, round face. And it was just beaming. And so he sat down, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, you now have seen the value of having human beings in space." So I'm thinking to myself, no one made us put that up there. No one made it. Okay, I'll give it to you. Go ahead. So he goes, "When the history of the 21st century is written, it will not be about wars in some dusty corner of the planet, but the steps which humanity took to get off of the planet." And I wanted to walk up there and hug him and pat him on the back and go, there, you really believe that, don't you? Isn't it just... And it became clear to me in that moment that space is a religion. For a lot of people, it is a religion. It is based, a lot of the people who work in space believe they're doing the Lord's work. They're doing something to preserve the species. There's an underlying belief that sometime in the near future, a giant rock is going to be coming towards us, and we're going to be facing a dinosaur moment, or we'll mess up, and we're going to be Battlestar Galactica, surging around the universe looking for a place to live while we fend off robots, right? I remember Lewis Black once said, he was talking about robots, and he was talking about robots that clean the floors, the Roombas, and the ones that you put drywall on. He goes, cleaning floors and doing drywall, no wonder they rise up and destroy us. So another reason why NASA was, but it is, and it really does have all the little components of the religion. It has holy texts, it has martyrs, it has saints, and the more you get into it, it has a tremendous amount of dogma. And if you're like me, who's an old cynic and an old war journalist, it didn't have that. It was just a government program. You said you're going to be spending this much, and you're spending 10 times more of that. I remember I walked in one time, and I asked the head of the program, why are we going back to the moon? And he literally did this, as if he were looking for a hidden camera somewhere. And he said, "I thought you were the space editor for the Orlando Sentinel." I said, "Well, I am." And he goes, "Well, how could you ask me such a question?" And I said, "Because you've never explained why are we spending $150 billion to go back to where we've already been. What do we expect? And that was what I found also was a rather interesting period. I was like Martin Luther, at the time, asking questions that they didn't want to be asked. And the irony is, the more I came to kind of see space as a government program that needed accountability, that needed to justify itself, that needed to connect with people, the more the establishment hated me. And the more the establishment hated me, the more my star rose. So when I left journalism, or when I decided to leave journalism, I was beset upon by all these people saying, come and work with us. Because I think there was a recognition about the other thing that I've realized is that the biggest problem that space has is it doesn't connect with you in any way. It's not relevant. When I was growing up as a kid, and I'm now in my 50s, but it was the space age. And if you wanted to advertise something cool, it was space age materials. I must have gained 20 pounds eating this peanut butter sticks that supposedly the astronauts ate as a kid because the astronauts ate it, so I might as well. And that doesn't exist anymore. Space is a religion in every extent except it doesn't proselytize. It doesn't sell itself well. It doesn't sell its image well. As a matter of fact, it's failing. One of the biggest successes that the human spaceflight program has had recently was getting the Big Bang Theory to make one of its characters an astronaut and make the station, because this is where he was going, was the International Space Station. And there was an episode, I don't know if you've seen it, where he has to go and try to talk girls into being interested in science. And he was the astronaut, wasn't that cool, so are there any questions? And a little girl raises her hand and says, have you been to the moon? And he says, no, but I've been to the International Space Station. She goes, well, what's that do? He goes, that flies around the world. He goes, oh, you're like my uncle who's a flight attendant on a plane. He flies all around as well. And in that moment, even what NASA is doing and what the spaceflight program is doing is failing. So a lot of what I've been doing over the last few years, first at SpaceX and then for Casis and now independently, I'm a consultant for well, I basically run a lot of the outreach programs for the Golden Spike Company, which is a private company which believes that it can use existing rockets and technologies and with very minimum investment, start going back to the moon for science missions, and particularly to take everyone to the moon. And by everyone, it's everyone who could afford $1.5 billion ticket, which really means governments and some very wealthy corporations or pharmaceutical companies that might be interested in doing so. And one of the biggest challenges that you had was, and that you have, is how do you connect this to people? How do you make this relevant? This was the big argument I used to have at NASA at Casis, that the biggest problem with the space station was most people didn't know it was there. And once they knew it was there, they didn't understand what it was doing. And the interesting thing about what Casis was doing that I thought was the most powerful thing is everything that we have now that was somehow rooted in space technology, whether it be cell phones or power tools, handheld power tools, which is probably the most widely used spin-off from the space era because they needed to figure out how to fix stuff in space, and you couldn't have cords going all over there because it would go all over the place. So the idea of carrying a long-lasting battery with you. No one knows that. There's no connection when you pick up a power tool to know that. Everything that was ever done, everything that ever came from the space program was an accident. It was meant for something else, and someone said, hey, we could sell this at Home Depot. This was the first time that we had thought of using space, the properties of space, microgravity, atomic oxygen, vacuums, extreme changes in temperatures, sunrises every, 45, sunrises and sunsets every 90 minutes, to develop stuff, whether it's consumer goods or treatments or new drugs, for the benefit of people on Earth. And that was the most exciting thing, that the first time in the 50 some odd years we've been doing this, we were going to use space for us. And it was the one message that NASA and Casis had the most difficult time spreading that and making it relevant. And I did a lot of work with Fiction, who's one of the Mama Sauce. I don't know if you guys know, but one of the partners in Mama Sauce works at Fiction. And we were trying to do a lot of the out-of-the-box thinking of how do you connect this? How do you connect space to make it click with people? And I think until we do that, and it's just not me. I was at a symposium a few years back, and I heard Michael deGrasse Tyson of the New York Museum and Planetarium, who's very eloquent and very charismatic, basically say to a bunch of stuffy officials, and that's the other thing is, because the government has been the primary mover in this, you have a very monopolistic, I mean, you get into $800 toilet seats and $10,000 hammers because of the way that budgeting works, and so you have all these incredibly gray white men. I'm sorry, I didn't break the mold there. But you have these very stuffy people from these big corporations who are sitting there who think that what they're doing is, great for the bottom line, and they're just milking the government terribly. And his message to them is, if you can't reach out into pop culture and make yourself relevant in pop culture terms, go back to the days of when stuff was made in space and there was those little peanut butter sticks. If you can't do that, then you're not relevant. And if you're not relevant, you don't matter. And I think this is the big challenge that lays ahead with anyone working, particularly in the creative side of space. It's how to take what they do and communicate that coolness and that connection beyond. Now, there's a lot of buzz now about commercial space, and I worked in commercial space and to some degree obviously still do. And commercial space even is a bit of a misnomer. The problem is, I mean, let's just go to Golden Spike. $1.5 billion for, let's say you want to split the ticket, $750 million. Where do you have that? Now, Elon's line was that, imagine if it was an airplane, if every time you flew somewhere, you had to throw the plane away, how much it would cost to fly to Chicago or to LA or to New York. It would be prohibitively expensive. We probably would get meals, though. At the same time, it's the ability to keep flying that plane where you can amortize the cost of those, $700 million or whatever a plane costs, those new Dreamliners cost, over a period of time that eventually you pay it off and these things become. If you could do that with rocket ships, this would unlock this tremendous potential in which the cost of going to space would come down considerably. And everyone's been excited about this, and this has been a driving force to all this. The problem is, which no one thinks about, is where do you go? I mean, where do you go and what do you do? Right now, NASA controls the only destination that anyone can go to, which is the International Space Station. There is a guy called Bob Bigelow, who is a hotelier a billionaire from Las Vegas, whose dream is he actually has taken a discard technology from NASA, which is like a semi-inflating kind of space station. It's kind of like those tents that you can have that you pull it out of the bag and, it comes out. It's a similar thing. It folds up into a fairing. The fairing comes off and it becomes rigid and all the electrical connections have. But again, what do you have that for? An initial market is, of course, for rich oil men to bonk their mistresses in space and to talk about, well, I went up to space and took Susie with me, and then he can tell all his friends. But when you get beyond that, well, what do you use it for? Well, okay, a research platform. Okay, researching what? I mean, one of the biggest problems we had in CASIS was trying to get corporate America to buy into the notion that researching in space was important, and to do it in an elevator pitch, because usually that's all the time that a lot of these people had. And you have to understand, to do stuff in space is very expensive, particularly from a corporate level. You're not flying people, but you're flying stuff. And that stuff needs to be protected in the course of flying. It needs to be protected from radiation. All that stuff is a lot of money. So if you're going to want to do research in space, you want to know that your return is going to be huge, or even better, I can do a lot of this on Earth, so why should I even think about it? And they've not been able to close that loop either. So commercial space is like most of space. It's a siren out there beckoning us with all kinds of wonderful promises. but it's still largely unproven. And I think that when you come back to the analogy of space being a religion, and like all religions, there's something very romantic and noble about it, that's what keeps us looking up, and that's what enables it to go. But I do think that we have a responsibility to make space work, to basically help the guys focus their dreams and make their dreams relevant to everybody. And I think that's probably where I'll end it. Yes, I get sick on Ferris wheels. Nothing?
What do you think of Elon Musk is hoping to get to Mars? What do you
think of that? Elon is kind of like the Howard Hughes of space. You have to remember that a lot of the stuff that all these commercial space companies are doing right now, we as a nation did in 1963. It's Gemini. We're trying to figure out a way of how commercial companies can, in an affordable way, can take modern day technology and do what we did, 50 years ago. And so far it's proven difficult, and where Elon has been a genius has been doing that. And that's basically all that he's been able to get to. The steps that are required to go from Gemini to Mars are huge. Now, I don't know if you guys know this, but NASA only has one guy that won a Nobel laureate, won a Nobel Prize. His name is John. I don't remember his last name. It starts with an M. But I felt like the scene from when I first time I met him. I felt like that scene from Pulp Fiction where I wanted to say, check out the brain on John. I mean, he really was, I really did feel, this big. He really was incredibly bright. And it was the first time I heard this notion of the real challenge was to get people to Mars and get them home. Of course, they had no shortage of people who wanted to go on a one-way trip. And I said, what? I said, you're serious? He goes, oh yeah. Lots of people would want to do that. And I said, well, it's kind of romantic, isn't it? And he looked at me as if I was nuts and goes, romance has nothing to do with it. But to prove the point was, I think 17,000 people on this for this private Mars mission, which is aiming to do just that, send people to Mars with enough Twinkies that they can get by for a while until they have to fight amongst themselves for the last one. 17,000 people volunteered for this. But even that is a really difficult, it's not only the time, but we don't have a way for radiation. Space is like, one of the biggest problems with space, the way we do it right now, is all the crap we need to carry up with us. Fuel, for instance. You got to pack those things full of fuel. And the more fuel you have, the more fuel you need to burn it to get the weight up and get it out to slip the bonds of gravity, which is really powerful stuff. So it's even worse if you want to go on long distance travels, because the only thing that we know, we are really lucky for all the guys that went to the moon. No one ever really got exposed to radiation at a level that we can die. However, there are a lot of astronauts that have a lot of, there are a significant number, percentage-wise, of people who have developed all different kinds of cancers and problems. Is that due to radiation? Is it due to something else? We don't know. But radiation is a major problem. And the best shield we have so far is water. Water's not light. And to create the kind of walls you need to shield people create all kinds of weight problems. So there's a kind of birth of people looking for technologies, batteries. It's a long haul. And Elon fills a really important niche in the world. And that is, he's a dreamer with means. When you have the amount of money that he has and the charisma and conviction that he has, you tend to attract people and you tend to get stuff done. Elon at the same time he's SpaceX's best asset. He also has, a personality that has. I used to say that there's a word for someone who takes a lion's share of selling PayPal and making that money and buying electric car companies and companies that build rocket ships to go to Mars. One of them is called Dreamer. The other one is a megalomaniac, because in some ways there's a point in time where those two kinds of things come together, because you have to be so cocksure of your vision that you don't want reality to, or anyone else telling you limits. So you have to have a real hard edge, and he does possess that. But I think we're a long way off, much longer than, I mean, SpaceX still has to be able to get human beings to the space station first. It still has to get a launch rate going because it's a business. And if he becomes just another government contractor, because I was saying with the guys wanting to go back to the moon, no one has 750 million. It's governments who are going to do that. And so until you break out of the government market and start like launching commercial satellites, and I always thought the biggest future in space was to be a scrap dealer, because there's so much crap up. Every time you'd watch a spacewalk, the most human thing that people would do is that you'd use a wrench and then put it down and then go back for it. And right now that wrench is spinning at 17,500 miles around the Earth, and there's tons of wrenches up there. And there's tons of broken satellites and old satellites, and filled with palladium and gold and all kinds of other stuff. So eventually I imagine the first real commercial use of space are going to be, like the mafia will do, commercial space sanitation and going up there and mining. But I mean, in a way, and if you think about it, again, commercial space, the other thing is, satellites, which is that's where the real money is in space. If you want to get money in space, it's satellites. Either satellites that can see you in the shower, or satellites that can communicate across the world with bandwidth and with other kinds of things, which is eventually, they say, what we're going to have to go to increase the demands on the internet. But if you think about it, the problem with satellites, and the military is the one that's most frustrated with this, is a satellite goes in a set orbit. You just can't, if all of a sudden you have Upper Mongolia causing you problems and you don't have a satellite over that area, you just can't kind of send a message in and send it there. So in response, there's a lot of things that we use now that also kind of undermine satellites. Drones are one, because we can put them where we want them. We can put them at great heights. And the other thing that they have, which is very cool now, which again is another spin-off from the space program, and like the firefighters that got burned would have been a really good, eventually they would be great customers for this. But it's a small handheld rocket, literally, and that you pull it, and it's linked to your smartphone or your watch or whatever it is, and it goes up and it gives you 360 degrees, and it can hover, and it can monitor things, and it can come down, and of course there's a version where they have a bomb at the end of it and it can blow things up. But that kind of ability to get that kind of high ground, and you don't have to spend $150 million just on a ride, because there's a lot of guys that develop satellite sensor technology that can more accurately depict climate change or weather or different kinds of things like that. The problem is that the cost to test that technology they developed, I mean, an average rocket ride, I think Elon's is the cheapest, but it's the base model. It doesn't come with all the other services, because like every model, it's all the fine print. But it's $60 million. Most rocket launches in reality cost anywhere between $100 to $200 million. That's just the bus ride. That's not the little satellite you have to make that will fly around to test whatever it is. So, like I said, it may be a religion, but there's a lot of bling involved in it.
In the context of seeing space as a religion, where do you place science fiction writers?
Where do I place what? Science fiction writers? They at a very warm place in my heart. Sci-fi writers are doing what I said we all, people in creative, it needs to connect that dream and make it real. Ironically, I think that a lot of people, part of the thing that's ultimately ironically undermines space is, you guys know what the Csi Effect are? Have you ever heard that expression? Do you guys know that? That people watch CSI all the time, and you can get, we've got his DNA. Oh, that's a match, and it takes place like in 20 seconds. We know for sure. And so juries go into murder cases, and, real life doesn't work like CSI, but jurors go like, how the hell they screw this up? You know, I watch CSI all the time and they get this information immediately. There's something very similar, I think, that affects the space world because in a way, while we've never really slipped the bonds of Earth's gravity and gone beyond the moon, which is still in that general pocket, we do it all the time, every week. You know, you can go to the movies and we're being eaten by animals on other worlds and, you know, trying to discover our origins with horrible results. But I mean, we do that all the time. And so in a way, we become so immune to the idea of, I mean, you know, what was the central theme in Apollo 13? It was like the third moon mission and everyone didn't care. They didn't carry it, you know, the networks didn't carry the broadcast because we're very fickle, you know, as a society. And I think science fiction writers have the ability to kind of break through that. I think we're a long way. I personally am not a member of the religion. As a matter of fact, I think that's the one thing that makes me a real honest broker and why the space community keeps coming back to me. Because my argument is it doesn't connect with people like me who don't care. And if you want to connect with me, most of the people who covered NASA before I came in were like, oh, NASA cheerleaders, no bad news, don't ask hard questions, just it's cool, say stuff because it's cool. In reality, I think they did a big disservice to the agency because they never held them accountable in any way. I think that science fiction writers are one of the few ways to you know, I'm a big fan. And I think that it's one of the few ways that we can get the religion back on track. Right now, NASA has no direction. And right now, NASA has no direction. I mean, again, let's go back to the religion. NASA, there was a director a few years ago. It was great. We used to, you know, in that spirit of no one would challenge, and NASA was not used to being challenged, and the administrator was called Mike Griffin. And Mike was the smartest guy in the room, with no doubt. If you didn't believe me, you could ask him, and he would tell you he was the smartest guy in the room. An amazing character, and we used to clash all the time. And I wasn't, you know, he would yell at me that I'm not, because I predicted that the moon program they had a few years ago, and I was writing very critically of it, was going to go nowhere. And he would always argue to me that I didn't have I had no technical skill. I mean, I have a very other interesting background. I used to joke at the Wall Street Journal that I was the only high school dropout ex-con working at the Wall Street Journal. I never made that claim at the Sentinel because you never know. But, so he would call me a Philistine. You know, I'd ask him a question. He said, "You're a Philistine." And I would stop and I'd go, "You're right, but that has nothing to do with the question." And Mike Griffin proceeded down a path of this huge spending. And my argument was it was never going to work. It didn't have to do with technology. It had to do with schedule and budget. Okay, this is the money you have. This is when you're supposed to do it together. And you just couldn't connect the two. It was impossible. And he refused to believe that. And he refused because he believed that space was so important that he would run for the cliffs. And it was so important that no one would let him go over. And what Mike literally did was Thelma and Louise. Expecting to be saved at the last minute, he went over. And since then, NASA has had very little direction. And part of the problem is money, because NASA had, if you add up all the programs that NASA started and then crashed and burned, okay, I think the last time I did it was close to like 27 billion, and I'm sure I missed a lot of programs. That's stuff that we spent money on that went nowhere. That's a huge amount of money. And in this current environment, the idea that we're going to get enough money to have another program, the real hope is these commercial guys. Can there be a public, and I want to not change it to commercial, can there be a public sector relationship that makes it work? Part of the problem that we're also in this position is that the contractors who make space, this is a long way to answer your question, but you'll see where I'm getting. The Lockheed Martins, the Northrops, the Boeings, they work on what's called cost-plus contracts. Do you guys know what that is? Effectively, is they say, you know, hey, how much is it going to cost to go to the moon? It'll be about $100 million plus expenses. It's that plus expenses that kills you. Because they tell you to erase a line, and you know they always cha-ching, you know, oh, we erased a line, it's another $30 million. And every overrun, like a normal business, you know you're getting a certain budget. You have to keep everything to make sure that you fall within that budget, because if you bust your budget, you're in losing territory and therefore you're in trouble. But when you've got a guarantee that anytime you bust your budget, the government is going to cover the overruns, there is no incentive for you whatsoever to be fiscally responsible. And what happened is all these contractors would, we need a design. And so instead of giving them, having conversations and months talking about narrow it down to the 10 best designs, they'll give NASA 160 designs to work with, knowing that all the time in every design they go through is just, that cash register is just chinging away. The new space guys are operating on fixed price contracts. It's the same as a pool guy. You would not hire someone to build a pool in your backyard if he couldn't tell you more or less what it's going to come to. And if he doesn't come to that, he's going to have to eat the loss. So where I think the future lies and what everyone's hoping for is that these new guys like Elon that are trying to work on a fixed price model, that this is what the cost will be. And the other part of that model is you only get paid at milestones. No one gives you the money up front. So you have to constantly work for your dinner. That may be the hope of restoring a program. But right now, the space program in this state is in serious trouble. The state has a special entity called Space Florida that's trying to develop alternatives. They're having a tough time. So it's a question mark. The theory is that we're hoping it's like the 70s when Nixon all of a sudden canceled Apollo, and 8 years later they came up with the shuttle program. There was an army of workers. I don't think that's happening again. So for the foreseeable future, you're having a bunch of NASA officials running around going, the future's bright, but the tumbleweeds are blowing through.